A Christian response to Israeli apartheid, a biblical reflection. Although the term apartheid emerged in the 20th century, supremacism, segregation, racial prejudice can be traced back to biblical times, and sadly, it was prevalent even among God's people, just as it is now. Through the prophet Isaiah, God says, "Let no foreigner who's bound themselves to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people." And foreigners who've bound themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, who hold fast to my covenant, these I'll bring to my holy mountain, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. Now just think about it. Why would foreigners say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people? If God has said, don't say it, why would the foreigners say it? Why would the foreigners feel excluded from God's presence? The simple answer is, it's because the Lord's people were doing the excluding. They thought that they could maintain their racial purity, their supremacy, by not mixing with the Gentiles, by forbidding mixed marriages, and by erecting separation barriers between themselves and other nations. Notice why the Lord God forbids this arrogance and prejudice. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. You see, God is saying, this is my house, not your house. I decide who's welcome in my house. These words are familiar because Jesus quotes them. Jesus has entered the temple. It says, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not let anyone carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And why does Jesus quote Isaiah 56? Because the temple had become segregated by ethnicity. Solomon's temple wasn't segregated, but the temple Herod built centuries later had separate areas for Jews and for Gentiles, divided by a Hafrada fence. The merchants and the money changers were trading in the court of the Gentiles, which made it difficult, if not impossible, for foreigners to worship the one true God. Add to that, the merchants were pricing the doves and the lambs at exorbitant rates. The rate of exchange for the temple currency was inflated to exploit the gullible foreign pilgrims. But there's more to it than that. Traditionally, this story is called what? Jesus cleansing the temple. The more I think about it, the more I'm less convinced that's what Jesus was doing. Did his actions change anything? What happened the moment Jesus left the temple? The merchants and the money changers would have cleaned up, picked up their tables and started trading again. No, Jesus wasn't cleansing the temple. Jesus was closing the temple. Jesus was serving the scribes and Pharisees with their redundancy papers. He was posting a demolition order on the building. How do we know that? Well, when challenged to prove his authority, Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. They replied, it's taken 46 years to build this temple. You're going to raise it in 3 days? The temple he'd spoken of was his body. You see, the temple in Jerusalem was a temporary structure. It was destroyed within a generation of Jesus uttering these words. Indeed, God hadn't wanted a temple in the first place. He was content to dwell in a tabernacle. God's people wanted a temple, and so he reluctantly. It was temporary because the true temple had arrived. Jesus is the temple of God. Conversation between Jesus and the woman of Samaria in John chapter 4. She reminds Jesus of the dispute over the location of the temple. Samaritans were excluded from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and so they'd built their own one in Samaria. But notice how Jesus replies, "Woman, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the spirit and in truth." Notice Jesus says that time has now come. It has come because Jesus was there. And what happened the moment Jesus died on the cross? At that very moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. It was a miracle. You see, access to our holy God was now possible without a temple, without a high priest, without an animal sacrifice, because Jesus fulfilled the role of the temple when he died in our place. He was our sacrifice, not just for the Jews, for all nations. But as we read the rest of the New Testament, we find something even more incredible. We find that there is another temple. It is under construction. It's made of people. The Apostle Peter says, "As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices." You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You see, it was the Gentiles who were not a people. They were not the chosen people. It's what the Israelites said. You're not part of us. But in Jesus Christ, we're all one in him. You are now the people of God. This is the glorious vision of the people of God from all nations united in Jesus Christ. This is God's answer to the segregationists, to Christian apologists for white supremacism, for Zionism today. God opposed apartheid then, God opposes apartheid now. There's no place for apartheid or Ephrata or ethnic segregation among the people of God. In his death in our place, Christ has broken down the Ephrata wall of partition. That is why in our Seville Kairos UK conference statement, we affirm that all people are created equal in the image of God. It is why we repudiate all forms of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, all forms of racism and discrimination, and we recommit ourselves to work for justice, for peace, and reconciliation.